Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good evening, depending on where we're speaking from. I'm with my dear friend Kara from South Africa, so it's evening time for you. It's morning time here in Southern California. I'd love you to introduce yourself, Kara, and I'll introduce myself too, and then we'll dive into today's topic. Kara Durant.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you here. What is it you're doing with Lockdown Open Up in a nutshell, Kara?
As of late, I think it's really come to surface the sort of support that we're trying to facilitate. It's fundamentally in the beginning of lockdown started as we aim to provide the connection between people being able to face their stuff that they might not have been dealing with before lockdown. That's sort of been magnified during this time. And I think, as we all know now, in most countries, everyone's expressing that, whether it be political stuff or economical stuff, things happening in areas of work, at home, relationships, finances, health, addiction, recovery. So it's all the aspects of our lives that I think are coming out now in one way or another. So the group initially was to provide a safe social space to communicate that. And we ourselves, or myself, I'm not there to give any kind of solicited or professional advice. I was also looking for support. And as a community, we would reach out to people who had experience and knowledge and qualifications to facilitate that kind of guidance and support. So through my experience with marketing, that's where I did come in with connecting our members to these people. So if we were talking about a problem, if the topic was to do with addiction and recovery, I use you as an example in how we connected, Dr. Bob. We'd reach out to a doctor or a psychiatrist or someone who works in that field, and we'd host a conversation facilitated by someone like yourself, and just open up that conversation so that we'd have a safe space to be able to communicate that, because I think that's what's really coming up now is this whole thing of shame and stigma, and being able to talk about the things that aren't always so comfortable, maybe, or the things that we maybe aren't educated on enough. And so we're all feeling very strongly about things as we are starting to trying to identify or re-identify new belief systems. So we need to, I think it's really important that we find people who are educated in these things, as opposed to just forming our own, going in blindly. So yeah, I mean, the Lockdown Open Up group has now become so broad in that sense, but at the same time, trying to, what's most important, keep it not one strict ideal, so that people can maintain their own belief system or their own. It's also ever changing, so it's up to their own interpretation. So we're really trying to work hard at not imposing our own stuff on everyone else, and if there is an opinion expressed, making that clear that it's an opinion and you must form your own, take what you want from that. So yeah, it is a process. We're all going through this in one way or another, whether it's at work or at home or in a relationship, trying to find ourselves and figure out what it is that we, how to navigate this. It's a challenging time, but that's essentially Lockdown Open Up.
Thank you, Kara. It's really rich, all that you've shared right now. Really appreciate what you're doing. I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet you a few weeks ago through our mutual friend Guy Duplessis. Guy's been a long-term friend whose specialty is the addiction recovery piece of what you're talking about, which is as embracing, as inclusive an approach as possible. I hew to that same approach in my own work. Guy's written several books on integral recovery. We're working right now together on a book project. And I just spoke yesterday with kind of the founding author, John Dupuy, in this whole area. I wouldn't have imagined that when my creative partner, Jason, and I started the Vitality Project a little over a year ago, and we began including daily starting exactly a year ago. The idea of the Vitality Project is very much in sync with you, Kara, with Lockdown Open Up. It was clear to me that the priority, and you and I've talked before, we can talk more today about it in terms of your own relationship to addiction in your family. It was very clear to me that sobriety from addiction to substance is kind of like the first step, and it's an essential step. You can't really bypass it. And have a life of fulfillment, of robustness, what I call vitality. The problem for me in much of the recovery work that I was involved in personally as well as professionally is it tended to just kind of stop there, as if what's going on in the world doesn't matter, as if what's going on in our relationships is secondary, as what's percolating up in our psyches is. And I just felt like, can we have another step beyond what's being proffered right now, whether it's in treatment programs? Most treatment centers, and I've consulted now for easily a dozen different treatment centers over the last 10 to 20 years. Most of them do a pretty good job, I think, in terms of helping people to get sober, whether it's a 30-day program or longer. It's that when people get out and they face the real world problems that we're talking about. Last week, we talked about gender-based violence. Today, we'll be talking about leadership and the vacuum of that and so on. These are the kinds of issues that arise for all of us as human beings. They drive all of us to madness. And for those of us that have been addicted, severely addicted to substance, it'll drive us to relapse. And so I just felt like we need to have this kind of conversation. And our connection, Kara, goes right into that sweet spot for me. I asked you before we started, because it's new for me, what I've been calling the Vitality Project for the last year in my work with Jason, and in your Lockdown Open Up, we've merged them, and now it's the Vitality Project Unlocked.
Yeah.
I like that a lot, and I have to get used to it, because that's really the wish is to unlock all topics, unlock biases and prejudices. I love what you said right now, Kara. I come from a background in clinical psychology, which is based in science, and so I've got a skew towards science. I don't like saying stuff that just occurs to me as a great idea. I like to base what I say, if possible, in scientific research, but that's in the domain of psychology. And there's not science doesn't apply to everything, but at least let's apply rigorous or critical thinking to statements that we make. And I think I can speak for the U.S. and I can't speak for South Africa, but there's such a polarization, as you and most of our listeners are well aware of. There's such a polarization currently in the political and economic and racial, gender, sexual orientation, climate. The conversations are so polarized right now. And one of the things that's missing is the capacity to hear and be respectful of opposing positions, as well as, I'd say what you just said, is as well as to establish and articulate a position that is based in something that's coherent rather than just raw emotion. We all have emotional reactions, and that's fine, but can we step up the conversation? Our conversations, yours and my dialogue so far, has been really rooted in that. Last week's guest, as we talked about gender-based violence, speaks deeply personally, but is also incredibly articulate and bright and respectful. I was so struck by her evenness in discussing something, whether it was discussing the legal system and what she's been through in South Africa, could just as well have happened in the U.S., what she's gone through. It happens every day in the U.S. But I was really struck by it. I have the chills right now because I was just so struck by her being able to be with really provocative material in a way that's, I think, respectful of herself, but also respectful of competing paradigms or positions. The legal system has its approach. The police, the law enforcement has its approach. And you and I, well, all three of us talked about how it is that people just in the streets, they have their opinions. So how can we be inclusive? How can we address hot spots? That's a little bit of what it is that I do and what brings us together. What I'd like to do edge into our topic for the day, which is our addressing stepping up into leadership positions, particularly when leaders fail us. And we can talk about this as globally as we want on a national or international level. We can talk about it as locally as we want to in terms of family members, parents, coaches, teachers. We've included sponsors in programs. I'm open to wherever we want to go with that. I'm just looking forward to where we go with that, being of service to those that are in recovery. And I don't draw a narrow circle in recovery from addiction for sure, which could include addiction to alcohol and other drugs, also include addiction to behaviors that are self-defeating. And all of us are engaged in those and managing those right now, especially in a time of stress like this. And even engagement with the attitudes that you're talking about, Kara, attitudes that would exclude people or disrespect people. I think that can be as much of an addiction. It can give me a momentary feeling of I'm superior if I can treat you awful. And it's like, can we just stop that and just be honest with ourselves, but find some other way to interact? So we're looking today at recovering our best selves. And I think that's the heart of what you're doing in Lockdown Open Up. Certainly is part and parcel of Vitality Project to me. It's not enough to get literally sober. It's like we want to be the best, fullest selves we can be. So let's talk into that. So let's talk about this issue of leadership. I'd like to hand the baton to you and have you go where you go with it. And I'll pipe in as it seems appropriate. Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What is it for you? What's kind of come up or what's crossed your desk or come to your attention in the last days around this leadership issue?
I think sort of as you were speaking, so much pops up that highlights this topic of leadership, and also just on the topic of putting people in boxes and defining, maybe let's use addiction and recovery. When it comes to labeling and putting people in boxes with that, I know that we've said this before, that we're all recovering from something. And as far as addiction goes, we can all be maybe, if we take addiction and use it more in a broader sense and apply it to being conditioned or obsessed or fixated, or there's so many other tangible words we could use. And I mean, I'll use myself as an example. I mean, we have to use ourselves as an example, or to relate. I come from a family of dysfunction, and I grew up in dysfunction, and my family and I acknowledge that. And there were certain coping mechanisms that I adopted early on in order to deal, but not deal with it. And as a result of long-term not dealing so well, there were consequences. And some of those coping mechanisms were caused habitual, unhealthy addiction-like, I suppose, but they were addictions, and they weren't necessarily substance addictions, but they were.
Something, Carol, let me step in real quick. Sometimes it's helpful for me in my own thinking. I'm not asking you to do this because it's up to you. But if I substitute the word addiction for its root in the Latin term enslavement, it almost like it frees me up, because addiction has got so many connotations to it, particularly, at least here in the US, its connotations are almost always related to alcohol and other drug addiction. A, and B, it's got such a negative or pejorative connotation. And I think of enslavement, and enslavement in whatever form is that we get enslaved to behaviors, including addiction to substances. We get enslaved to attitudes. Enslavement for me conjures up compassion. Addiction conjures up judgment. So I don't know if that's too awkward, but if people listening can just translate, I like the word addiction because I think it communicates, I like it in its root term. It means enslavement, but I don't think that people necessarily would translate it that way. So if you hear me or Kara use that term, please know that we're talking about enslavement in the broadest sense, and it's meant to include any form of enslavement. And then we're all in the soup together. There's not a one of us doesn't know about enslavement. Please continue, my dear. I just wanted to add that little, parenthesis in there. Thank you.
I'm glad you did, because I think when people hear the word addiction, they think she was on the street or whatever. And I mean, and a lot of people are, and that's the reality of for a lot of people. But doesn't necessarily also mean that, and there shouldn't be a stigma with that. So and this is why you and I are speaking about this, because you are educated on this enough to articulate it that way.
Can I say something, Kara? There's something that's so dear to me about this. I have weekly conversations with our mutual friend Guy in Cape Town, and I haven't realized till right now, as I listen to you speak, you and Guy are as different as night and day, but you're both South African, and you have certain ways of speaking. If you see me smiling sometimes, especially if it's inappropriate, it's because you remind me so much of Guy as South African. He's my only South African friend, and so it's really striking to me. Like I remind you of probably anybody you know from Texas, right? So at any rate, I want you to continue. It's very dear to me. I say it as the highest compliment because I have a deep love. Guy is like a brother to me. And there's a way that you express yourself. First of all, you're both so articulate. And there's a way that you express yourself that is just distinctly not American. And I value it highly. So there you have it.
I'm fine with being compared to Guy. He is super smart. I agree about being articulate. Him and I had a 2.5-hour conversation, an interview about ideology addiction last week. That was great. So yes, but okay, I'm going off topic now. But
no, it was me that went off topic. I just had to interrupt you, but we can pick back up where we were talking about. We're talking about addiction and your own history and how that went for you in terms of enslavement, let's say the behaviors in a family that was very challenging.
Yeah. So in terms of trying to identify leadership roles in this area, I was on my sort of biggest association with this is on the side that, or not the side, but relating to it in a way where I was what we call adult child, where in the household of the situation, my parents, so my leaders, my parents, had lost control of their leadership role. And I then had to find my own way to self-lead eventually. Not that it was probably the best way of doing it, but it's survival. You have to figure it out.
It was required. Yeah, you had to do it. You had to do it. I hear you. Yeah.
Not all the time, but there were a lot of times when you have when children have addict parents, I suppose you've got to there's certain basic survival things that you have to do. So you've got to learn how to do it yourself. So that from that point of view that I associate with addiction in that sense. So being able to identify with things doesn't always, it's not interpreted the same way for everyone else. But if we can have that conversation and understand that, it's important that we can be open to keeping that in mind. But it's not the same for everyone, because a lot of people, I think, don't necessarily think that way. It's like one way, you know. And
I have a thought here, Kara. Let me interject this, and then I want you to continue. Is that I love what you're starting with, because you're starting with your own personal story and your own experience around frustrations in terms of looking for leadership, in this case with your parents, and having to step in, which is the way that you coped, and it was necessary. I think everybody, I love what you're saying about it's distinctive. Everybody has their own story. But my guess is that we're touching on a universal theme here. So if it wasn't with one's parents, literally, it could be with other family members. It could be with other community leaders, employers, instructors, ministers, whatever, is that if we could start by doing what you're doing, if I can start with my own story so that I can realize that any reactions I have are rooted in a very, very deep personal place, it's not to disqualify that, but it's to make sure that I'm aware of what's getting stirred up with this. So, because the move oftentimes when we're frustrated is to move into aggression. And so we'll become aggressive, we'll become violent, we'll do the things that we do. Is there a way that we can hold to our story, your story, my story, and move towards some kind of constructive solution this side of killing off the enemy, killing off the Buddha, and so to start with our own stories, so that we be in a place, I think, of humility and also of grief. To start from that, I think, is a very different position than lashing out without any awareness of what's fueling this rage that I feel. There's nothing wrong with anger, but when it turns into rage and resentment, it can turn so easily into what we talked about last week, which is violence against somebody or even a class of people.
Yeah, I think also what's happening. I mean, if we relate my example to what's happening in our countries, where the government is maybe the parents of the situation or the leaders, we're also in. I mean, no one is strong right now, and this is a first-time situation for everyone. And I'm not condoning how certain governments are handling things, but at the same time, if we have to go, okay, that's how they're dealing with it. What can we do in our own capacity? How can we self-lead? If we had to hand over that responsibility to ourselves and each other, without shaming each other, if we question each other's way of self-parenting, because there are many different ways of doing it. I think that maybe that's what I'm getting at, is that we can't. If we let go of that, okay, I'm angry that my parents or my government or whatever, we accept that it is what it is. Let's get on with it now instead of reacting. And maybe we can look at the anger and all that later on. But for now, we need to get through a global pandemic and a virus as this infection rate is at its peak. Whilst we've got, new restrictions here in South Africa. So our president announced that the introduction of the alcohol ban is back. So that's, and there was no warning whatsoever. He just announced it, and that was on Sunday evening. He announced it with immediate effect. Alcohol is banned. So
what is the thought? I know we talked about this some last week and even previously. What's the thought there? Since we don't have a correlate, at least yet in the U.S., what is the thought there with the alcohol ban, Kara?
There are a couple. So obviously our domestic violence and abuse in South Africa is a huge issue. It was before lockdown. It always has been. Gender-based violence, as we spoke about last week, and that a lot. It is a big problem, and there were restrictions before in lockdown. Then alcohol was reintroduced back a few weeks ago, and apparently there was a spike in murder and abuse rates again. So there was that concern. But then a lot of people think that perhaps our government is using the alcohol as an excuse, as a scapegoat for problems that it should have dealt with. So
very
there's that.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
And then, the other thing that you hear a lot now is that, well, alcohol doesn't kill people or abuse women. People do that. So it's a huge argument. And then also that if we're going to ban something like alcohol completely, the consequences of that people are going to get access to it either way. And that could be fundamentally worse. So
let me interject some.
Actually,
say it again.
I'd be interested to hear what your opinion on it.
A couple of thoughts. First of all, it didn't work very well here in the U.S. with prohibition. It's infamous how that didn't work, and so there are issues with this for sure. I do want to say another piece about it, and I just want to direct people. Next Saturday, not this coming Saturday, but Saturday the 25th. We'll be going, we'll have a workshop here at the Vitality Project. I'd love for you to join if you're able to, by the way, Kara. And we'll be looking at addiction and what addiction, specifically to substance. And we'll use alcohol probably as the primary metaphor because it's so common here in the US, and it sounds like it's been a problem in South Africa too. It's a world problem for sure. Look at what addiction does to substance, what it does to our behaviors in terms of impulse control, specifically around anger and violence and so on. It'd be very hard to argue that alcohol isn't a problem with increasing violence because it disinhibits the part of our brain It removes the brakes in the part of our brain that is prone to being offended and striking out in violence and so on. Having said that, and that's true, and I will be talking about that. The title of the workshop is Don't Take Addiction Personally, because I want to talk about addiction just scientifically. This is what happens with the brain around substance. Having said that, I also don't doubt you that there could be multiple motivations by your government, as there are here in the US. It's very, very human, isn't it? When things aren't going well for ourselves or our side, whatever that happens to be, to find somebody to blame. So let's scapegoat the liquor stores. Let's scapegoat the alcoholics. Let's do that. And so it's one of the things that you and I have both shared is that there are multiple perspectives on any issue, and there's probably some validity to all of them. So I don't want to, even though my background is in addiction recovery, and I know that there's some problems with alcohol, I don't want to be naive about the implications of making it illegal. The prohibition didn't work with beans here in the U.S. And B, I don't want to also ignore the fact that your government, as here in the US, could be sidestepping its own responsibility by blaming it on some low-hanging fruit, if it's alcohol or you name it. So I'm with you with that. It's a complicated issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
What's the downside? Let me ask you, as a South African, what's the downside to making it illegal again?
To making it legal again? Sorry.
Illegal. So it's now back to being prohibited, right?
We're in level 3 of our lockdown restrictions, so we can't. There's no alcohol for sale at the moment.
Right. Right. And what's the downside to that? Just to make sure that we're fair to that side. You've implied it already, but what's a possible blind spot or a downside to making it illegal again?
Well, I suppose people are going to go and spend money that they don't have on illegal stock. So they start selling alcohol. It's like the cigarette thing. I mean, we don't have tobacco. That's still not on the market here. So people are still buying cigarettes from the illegal trade. And I think they cost, I don't know how much a box of cigarettes is at the moment. I stopped smoking, but that's not easy for everyone I know. But I don't think that's going to happen.
Would it be true, Kara, around this issue, and we're talking at least indirectly about leadership, about thought leadership in your government and in our government here in the US, is it requires some real serious thought. And here's one of the real serious thoughts that comes up for me just listening to you, is that if you take away my way of coping, and if that's been aided by cigarettes, if that's been aided by alcohol, and for 25% of adult Americans, they are clinically addicted to substance. If you include nicotine, 25%, 1 out of 4. And you can judge that as much, anybody can judge that if they want to. But the fact of the matter is that's 80 million Americans are addicted right now. And if you make that illegal and make that inaccessible, please help me understand how those people are going to cope with COVID. And I could be really misunderstood on this point, but it does beg the question is that we haven't addressed addiction in its roots. And now you're pulling away people's coping amidst the worst universal stressor in memory, at easily within a century. Please help me understand how that's going to work just psychologically, much less culturally. That's one thought that comes up for me.
I will. So then, going back to not my interpretation of addiction, then, as a ex-smoker before lockdown.
Yes. Yeah.
And now I'm on a vape still, thank goodness. And that's going to run out soon. But I really, really struggled with it being not my choice, out of my control. I didn't plan for this, because when they announced that lockdown was being extended with no grace period for there to be a chance to stock up on cigarettes, it's been 108 however many days now, and I went through, I can tell you now, a proper depression.
Oh, I can only imagine, Kara. Yeah. It's totally understandable. Totally be expected. Yeah.
On top of everything else, I'm also in the tourism industry, which has been one of the hardest hit industries in our country. I'm not minimizing the other industries that have also been hardest hit, but it genuinely has been one of the hardest hit industries. Up, down from government. We're supposed, it's a part of the biggest economy drivers is our travel and tourism industry. And it's the one that hasn't been able to open up properly.
Yeah.
Especially even domestically, we can't. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So as a smoker in the travel industry, psychologically having to put up with our leaders' indecisive mind control, in my opinion, and that is my opinion, it's very hard to be objectively, not react.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's the so as far as downsides and all that go, it's very hard to see.
Can I ask you a question about this in terms of the conversation at a regional or national level in South Africa? And I can certainly share my version of this in the US. Do you get a sense that you have governors or a president or other people at the top politically that have a sensitivity to what you're just talking about right now? You've just taken away your industry, you're taking away your livelihood for the extended future, and taken away ways of coping with that without any warning, by the way. Bam, you just don't have any access to cigarettes or alcohol or whatever anymore. Do you have a sense of people at the top having at least some awareness of that and communicating that to people, if for nothing else, to provide emotional support through an incredibly treacherous time? Any thought about that in your country? How does that go? We're so sorry, you guys, that this is so screwed up. I mean, that kind of conversation, basically,
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say as part of our cabinet right now.
Okay.
It's almost like it's like a prerequisite that as soon as you are in cabinet or in government, that your moral, your objectivity, all of that is this fight. It's like power. It's like Lord of the Rings. It's like one ring to rule them all, and it's it's that Gollum mentality where you just that power completely consumes you, and your ability to, as you say, to even if you were originally with best intentions wanted the best for the people. I don't know what happens in there. It's like it's gone. We're in a global pandemic, and they know people are dying. I mean, I read out the stats last week about how many women are being murdered every day in South Africa, and they know this. It's like they really don't care. This is now being the light is being, it's shining on South Africa with these awful rates, and they don't care. And they're going to carry on, and it's quite something. There are good people. I don't know if what's happened with government. There are other people externally who are, I believe, are genuinely trying to help and would care. But I
have a thought here. Just because as I listen to you, if you think about what happens to our brains in a fear response, and my Lord, if there's a time on a collective level for fear, this would be it, is that we contract away from caring about people more globally till we start moving towards our clan. We become more ethnocentric. And if you keep amping the fear up, we'll actually contract away from that down to being completely self-centered, egocentric. And I don't know if this applies or not, but I suspect it's relevant to what you're talking about politically and more largely than just politics in South Africa, certainly here in the US, is that what happens is you get people that might otherwise be able to think compassionately. Like you were saying, they might have had values when they were moving into the cabinet, let's say, but in a context like this where the fear quotient is so high, it begins to narrow down the vision where you have tunnel vision. And so things that are just absolutely unthinkable, such as the incredible spate of gender-based violence, it becomes a non-issue because, frankly, I don't give a damn. In this fearful spot, I want to take care of me. I probably want to take care of my constituents, the people that vote me into power, and anybody else can just go to hell. And I don't want to be cute about that because we're all humans. And so the thing to do is, how do you fight contracting away from having a compassionate awareness about other people? Here in the US, I wonder if this happened in South Africa. It was infamous at the very beginning of COVID. People would go to grocery stores and literally buy hundreds of rolls of toilet paper that they would never use over a period of years at the expense of anybody else. That's an example of what we're talking about, just complete contraction of concern about anybody else except for I, me, mine. And whether it's toilet paper or social or law enforcement issues, whatever in terms of human rights and so on. Human rights don't matter if I don't have oxygen. And if I perceive I don't have oxygen, then I don't give a damn about your rights. And that's sad to say, and it doesn't justify it. But we've got to get creative, and we have to be courageous to fight this, or we'll get sucked into what, lizards eat their young. That's basically what we end up becoming as lizards.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. Survival mentality. At the end of the day, we're in a global pandemic, and then should we be having people appointed, self-appointed sometimes, in the position of power like this, governing an entire country where we're one of the most diverse countries in the world, with so many different religions, cultures, languages, and we've got one governing system deciding our fate, and in a global pandemic. So why are we still doing this? And it's coming out now. Obviously, the entire country is raging and going, well, actually, no, we don't want to do this, and we're going to take matters into our own hands. We're going to self-parent, and it's going to be interesting now to see what's going to happen. I think we said this last week, when I quoted Richard Grannon, that humanity, and countries all over now have been are having this growth spurt, where we're trying to escape or humanity is trying to escape its adolescent, childlike state and grow up by almost rebelling in a sense, but rebelling against whatever your leader, your parent or your governing structure decided for you. And at some point you're allowed to question that and go, actually, this isn't working for me. Not now in a global pandemic where I need to survive and I'm losing everything. And you're old enough now to figure out your own system, belief system, governing system. And I guess that's what's happening.
Yeah. I appreciate very much that perspective. I actually share it with you. There's an opportunity here for us, as painful and as tragic as the circumstance is, for us to emerge through this with something more, something deeper, something greater. Do you have suggestions we're talking about leadership and what to do when leadership fails us? And there's different ways of understanding it. From a psychological perspective, I've just shared one way of understanding it. When leaders get scared, they're human beings, and they regress down to kind of the lowest common denominator in some cases. And so some of the things that are being said in South Africa from your leadership, certainly here in the US, we're infamous in the world for some of the things that come out of the highest levels of our government here, is that what is it that we as citizens who are maybe emerging from our own adolescence, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. What are some constructive things that you might suggest, Kara, from your own instincts? What are some constructive things that we might contribute, since we're on the cusp of some really huge tectonic shifts if we can step up to the plate? Any suggestions? Any thoughts about that?
I think, again, people must, if anyone says that they're okay and that they're that's putting on and again, especially people who are on public platforms, and that goes for influencers, people who are inspiring young people, be very careful of, no matter how strongly you feel about something, if it's worked for you, great, awesome. But if you're speaking to a public platform and setting an example, bear in mind that you don't want to be putting words in people's mouths and deciding for them, because I think people are very vulnerable and susceptible at the moment, especially young people who might still be. Guy actually said this last week. The emotional development of, as you go through the years, I mean, you'd have to look at the exact timelines of a person's process, especially now through pandemics, and some of us are experiencing PTSD and depression and all that. So it's going to change the whole network for people. But so to be aware that trying to, whether you're a parent or a teacher, when it comes to young people, try and get them to form their own, as much as possible, belief system. Guide them, but leave it open for interpretation for later on. And whether that's to do with your political beliefs or your relationship beliefs, whatever it is. I think people just need to be mindful of that, because everyone's really vulnerable at the moment. So obviously we're going to be, I mean, I know I'm a codependent. And I, as a result, can sometimes be very naive. And if someone speaks strongly and has a huge following, or they're, very talented, I can very easily believe what they say, and then I'll go on this sort of, wow, this person's really inspiring, or maybe something they've said is 100% spot on, but it doesn't mean everything they say and everything they do is right, or is going to change the human race. So I think it's
you remind me of a book I read years ago, written by Eric Hoffer. It was called The True Believer. It was a book on fundamentalism and mass movements. And he used what happened during the time of Hitler as an example, but he used other mass movements in history where you have people move from being able to kind of consider the whole range of possibilities, which is what you and I are supporting, to getting very black and white, and things are either black or white. And he put it in terms of fear. Is that if you can be in a time like the pandemic, which strikes fear in the hearts of all of us, and it's understandable that it should, and or if you can get people to be afraid, which is something that Hitler was able to mobilize in a mass way in Germany in post-World War I Germany, when they were just wiped out by the Versailles Treaty and the loss of economics and so on. He came in and capitalized on it, so he was able to actually ignite fear in people. And I think our current regime in the U.S. Unfortunately preys on this, is that go for people where they're vulnerable and get them afraid, and then you can manipulate them into black and white thinking. And so what we're talking about is some way to manage PTSD, some way to manage fear, because it's understandable right now, so that we don't resort to black and white thinking. I want to take what you said, by the way. I want to thank you for saying that, Kara. I think in a time of under duress, that we all are vulnerable to regressing to being codependent. That is to say, being vulnerable to people's authoritarian positions and so on. Many of us are able to think abstractly and objectively, and we can lose traction with that under fear and become where we think very, very concretely. And I'm sure Guy talked about this, is that you just start thinking very, very concretely. And then if you find somebody who's really Machiavellian, that is, they can prey on concrete thinking, oh, it's us against them, then you've got yourself a mass movement that's really scary on your hands. And so we need to fight the power. And one of the ways to fight the power is not give in to fear and not believe the hype that fearmongers would put forth. And I know that in the U.S. it's a major issue right now. There's so much polarization, us against them, and it's being fueled from the very top. And it's particularly pathetic to me in a time of universal need like this, universal deprivation and hardship. Let's prey on people's fears, and let's turn our animosity towards those, whoever those are, the ones we're going to scapegoat.
Yeah. It's it's the one thing now in lockdown, I've become so self-aware, and it's what I'm trying to focus on what I'm learning and how I'm growing now. And I'm reevaluating everything I ever thought I believed in. And not everything, but it's a lot. And I'm questioning things. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm not going to go and lobby a whole lot of people to join me in my change of thinking. And, we must go and stand outside. And I mean, I'm not going to get into that conversation, but I'm amazed. I'm almost tempted to, some days I just want to go off of social media to see all these, there's a lot of lobbying of people to join in on this fantastic revelation that you've had. That's great. But like, we're all just trying to figure out our shit at the moment and capacity. I think it's dangerous what some people are doing to convince everyone else of your realization. Let people figure that out for themselves first. Some people are very good at motivating what it is how they feel, whether that's a environmental issue or whatever that is that they feel strongly about. And I just think we need to be careful.
Freud, Sigmund Freud had this idea. He called it overdetermination, and he said that sometimes we'll get locked into an issue, whatever the issue is. I grew up in a family. My mother was incredibly environmentally conscious. She was very active in the 60s and 70s when I grew up in the Sierra Club here, which was a very almost militantly environmental organization, and I support those values. I support those values. But because I was her son and I was behind the scenes, I also realized how her response, again, to quote Freud, was overdetermined. And what I mean by overdetermined, it's like looking at what it is that fuels this. And so whatever the cause is, that happens to be a cause I care a lot about. But if I become rabid, like I'm gonna bite you if you don't agree with me, type of thing, then there's the concern and the overdetermined quality of it, which is what Freud was talking about, is that you need to be honest with yourself to kind of keep your hands clean when you're on an issue, to make sure that you don't end up kind of like channeling all of your rage against the universe, or we've been talking all of your rage against your parents or against your leaders or whatever like that, channeling that into an issue, because then what's the zen?
That's exactly what Guy said as well. Like you are displaying the same characteristics as someone who is hooked on heroin. Like when you're so like and broke by this ideal, like, okay, just calm down, find your inner peace and within yourself, because we're all trying to deal with the global pandemic and we're losing everything, and we've all got different ways of dealing with things. Like if that works for you, that's good. But no.
Yes. I like what I read by one psychologist some years ago. He said, and I took it to heart, he said, anytime, I'm going to put it in the first person, anytime you are affected by what somebody says rather than informed, Bobby, it's time to sit down and do what you said. It's some zen. Anytime you're affected rather than informed, and all he was talking about, it's not about not having feelings, but anytime that I am like a knee-jerk reflex, mobilized into action, and I'm gonna hurt you in words or worse. It's time to take a step back, because I should be informed by what you've said and communicate to you in such a way that I can help provide information to you. But if I'm somehow trying to hurt you or coerce you or feel hurt by you, let me do what you did starting off today, which is own up to the fact that we've been hurt or we've been disappointed, but own up to that. Don't cover that up by being into some issue and in the process violating other people. So anyway.
I used to do it. I was that person. I used to come up with this theory, or I'd hear it from someone else, and I would phone my dad or a sibling. Like, Dad, I've heard this. Dad, you need to hear this, because I never felt hurt as a child, but now I feel like I'm really intellectually inspired. Dad, you've got to try this. Dad, wait, you've got to try. And I get so passionate until I feel like I've gotten my point across. And I'm like, Dad, but you're not listening to me.
That's it. Right there, that's right there. It makes me think, Kara, because you're talking about a human thing, and I'll own this in the first person, just like you. If ever I say something to you like this, it's hard to imagine at this point, because I've been at this a while. If I were to say, you need, whatever follows that, Kara, you can just put up a hand, you can go time out, Bob, or whatever like this. If I say you need to do something, that's a flag, a red flag right there. Whereas I might say to you, I wish that you would hear me out, Dad. I wish you would hear me out, Kara. And you can make your decision. But if I'm already so far down the road that you need to see this movie, you need to read this book, you need to jump on this particular soapbox with me, right away you can question, kind of again, is that overdetermined? Chances are it is, because I'm obviously in a reactive mode rather than wanting to engage with you in dialogue. It's a monologue. I'm telling you, Dad, what you need to do.
That's what I love about you, Dr. Bob. That's my dialogue with you. I mean, you will offer advice or an experience, and you speak with me, not to me, and that's why I wanted to speak about this topic, because I know people are getting a lot of advice from people, which is great, whether it's a life coach, a teacher, and there are certain people in that authority figures, people from a place of advice who are saying that you need to do this, and you're like, well, how do you know? I mean, you probably studied this stuff from like 20 years ago. What if what you studied has totally changed?
Exactly.
And there are like some like psychologists who are still offering the same advice from books that they studied 20 years ago. They have not revisited.
No, I know of what you speak. I know of what you speak. I want to thank you, Kara. Kara, we're going to wind down in just a moment, but I want to thank you for your kindness right now. I want you to know, and this is confession time, when I entered psychology in the fall of 1977 as a psychology major, that's 42 years ago, I literally thought that to become a psychologist was I was going to learn how to tell people what to do. So I literally thought to myself, I'm going to be sitting with people saying, Kara, you need to do this. My first counseling class was in the fall of 1977, and I literally came home the first week from my first class in counseling, realizing that I had it all wrong and I was in trouble. I remember coming home to my mother-in-law and saying, Verna, I realized today that I don't know how to listen, because that was going to be key. And that had never entered my mind that would be what's necessary as like a foundation for being a psychologist. And I'll never forget her response to me. This is 42 years ago, Kara. She said, "That's right, Bob. You don't listen." and what she meant by that, I don't know if it has the same nuance in South Africa. We have particularly for me growing up in the South in Texas, you would tell somebody they don't listen if they're not doing what you told them to do. You're not listening to me, Kara, which really means you didn't do what I said. That's exactly what she meant. That wasn't what I meant. I didn't know how to step aside from my telling people what to do to be able to listen. That was true, and I began working on that for the next 42 years. I don't agree that listening to somebody means doing what they told you to do. And that's kind of our point here. If you can take what Kara and I've talked about today and find value in it, that's wonderful. If it helps to spur creativity for you in a different way, that's wonderful. That's our whole point with this, is for us to be able to open up, to create vulnerability. I love Kara. I love your vulnerability. Plus, you just crack me up. You're so doggone cute with your mannerisms. I just love your humanity. There's something so endearing about vulnerability is inviting. If people are vulnerable, like you and I are hoping to be here, it invites our own reflections. It invites safety. We want to join as part of the human condition. Let's start with that as a goal. And then whatever issues we discuss, can we keep it this way? Can we stay open? Can we stay vulnerable? Can we stay respectful? That's the point. It's not about telling people what to do. It's like, can we open a space where we can have genuine communion about things that really matter to us as humans, and allow for the fact that we're different human beings. You're a South African female. I'm a Texan male. It doesn't matter. I feel very connected to you when we talk, and it's about this respect that ties all of us together. So yeah, now I'm going to start crying. Any final comments as we begin to wind down, Kara? Anything that you want to say before we finish up today? It looks to me like technology may have brought our presentation to an end today. Kara, I want to thank you. You'll listen to this closing part later. We may have lost contact temporarily. The miracle is that we're able to have an hour's conversation this far apart from each other. I think we've lost contact with her. I'm going to say goodbye for right now. I thank all of you for joining me. Please consider writing your comments. Kara and I will respond to them. You can respond to us through Facebook, Lockdown Open Up, or Vitality Project. Please also consider joining me a week from this Saturday in an online workshop here at the Vitality Project, we'll be addressing the same topics we talked about today, which is how do we approach one another respectfully when we're talking about something that is as provocative, as incendiary as addiction is, and can we approach it from a scientific, evidence-based perspective that gives us room to express our feelings, but to be able to do that in a way that doesn't respect the other person. So more to follow. We'll be back next Tuesday, morning in California, evening in South Africa, with Kara here at Vitality Project Unlocked. Thank you all for joining us. Take good care. Be well.